Abusua ebibrem bɛyɛ yie na ebibrem bɛsan fa ne ntoma pa afira. Wohwɛ sɛsɛyi Captain Ibrahim Traore ne mpanimfoɔ ahodoɔ binom sɛnea wɔn asi abɔ wɔn adwene pɔ na wohwɛ animdefoɔ bi nneɛma a wɔakeka asi ani ɛfa wɔn aman yi ho na wohwɛ wɔn anammɔntu a wɔn retu de afa ɔman no ho a wotumi sɛ wɔwɔ pɛpa ɛwɔ sɛ wɔwɔ daakye papa bi ma ɔman no. Yɛnhwɛ videos ahodoɔ bi na yɛnhwɛ ntotoeɛ a wɔyɛ ɛwɔ wɔn aman ahodoɔ mu a sesei ɛfiri aseɛ ɛsaasan amanaman ahodoɔ a ebi mu ahyɛ aseɛ ɛresuasua wɔn mo. Yɛse wotu anammɔn papa a wonya obi a ɔno nso so ɛbɛba abɛtoa wo soɔ. Nti deɛ mpanimfoɔ yi yɛ yi afoforɔ nso rehwɛ bi asua ɛwɔ mu. Nti abusuafoɔ yɛmmo yɛn ani akɔ nhoma. Aha ɛyɛ Konkonko TV, so subscribe, share, like na comment.
Military intervention and Western dependency. One African crisis after another, and the default solution, outsource it to the West. But that era may finally be coming to an end. With the rise of bold, unapologetic leaders like President Ibrahim Traore, a new chapter is unfolding. Traore didn't wait for permission. He didn't follow the script. He tore it up and wrote his own, one rooted in sovereignty, self-reliance, and African pride. And now, other African leaders are starting to follow. At the recent International Security Conference, a rare moment of unity emerged. Leaders across the continent agreed on one thing: Africa's security challenges will never be solved by outsiders. It must come from within. But how did President Traore ignite this shift? How did one young revolutionary disrupt decades of dependency and force a new conversation across the continent? When Captain Ibrahim Traore emerged on the scene in 2022, he wasn't welcomed as a savior. He was condemned, criticized, and cast aside, even by his fellow African leaders. A young military officer taking power through a coup? To many, that was all the evidence they needed to dismiss him. No one stopped to ask why. Why would a man with no political ambition, barely in his 30s, risk everything to lead a nation teetering on the edge? But Traore made his intentions clear from the very beginning. In one of his first interviews, he said it plainly: "I did not take over simply because I wanted power. I did so because Burkina Faso was bleeding, and no one was doing anything to stop it." That was the heart of his mission. Not fame, not power, security, survival, sovereignty. While critics debated his legitimacy, Traore got to work. And his first move? Cutting ties with the West, especially France. It was a bold, controversial decision, but for Traore, the reasoning was clear. For years, foreign troops, mostly French and European forces, had set up bases across Burkina Faso, supposedly to help fight terrorism. The civilian government welcomed them, convinced that international military aid was the only way out. They had lost faith in their own army, lost faith in their people's ability to defend themselves, and so they handed over control, hoping the West would save them. But as the bullets kept flying and the blood kept spilling, it became clear. The West wasn't solving the crisis, it was managing it. And Traore wasn't going to let that continue, not on his watch. When French and EU forces first arrived in Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel, they were hailed as heroes. People cheered in the streets. After years of fear and bloodshed, the sight of Western troops with advanced gear and high-tech intelligence brought a flicker of hope. The belief was simple: with their satellites, drones, and precision weaponry, the nightmare of terrorism would finally come to an end. But that hope, so desperately clung to, was brutally shattered. As the years passed, the violence didn't slow, it escalated. Under the very watch of those foreign forces, terrorist groups didn't just survive, they thrived. They expanded their territories. They upgraded their weapons. Ironically, weapons more sophisticated than those held by Burkina Faso's own army. These groups infiltrated local villages, married into communities, and disappeared into the very fabric of Burkinabe society. They studied the patterns of the foreign forces and adapted. With every failed mission and unprotected town, the message became clear: the West was not winning this war. So when Traore stepped into power, he didn't need years of reports or intelligence briefings to see the truth. What use are foreign troops if the enemy only grows stronger in their presence? What's the point of alliances that offer no protection? Without hesitation, Traore cut ties. with France, with the EU, with every Western military pact that had failed to deliver. And as expected, the backlash was immediate. The international community labeled him reckless. Western media painted him as naive. Even some African leaders distanced themselves, warning that without France, terrorism would spiral out of control. But Traore had already made his decision, because for him, depending on failure was not an option. But as he's done time and again, Traore ignored the noise, the backlash, the media criticism, the diplomatic warnings. They didn't matter. He wasn't here to please the West. He was here to protect his people. And he knew that before Burkina Faso could fight back, it had to rebuild from within. The Burkinabe security forces were under-equipped and under-trained. They weren't ready for war. So, Traore rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He secured high-grade weapons. He initiated intensive military training programs. But he also understood a deeper truth. You can't win a war if your soldiers are trained by those who don't want you to win. So he turned east, to Russia. Not because Russia was flawless, but because it offered something the West never could: respect for Burkina Faso's sovereignty. The partnership was clear-eyed and mutual: training, weapons, and intelligence without the strings of neo-colonial control. But even then, Traore knew this could only be temporary. His vision was not to trade one dependency for another. His mission was to build a Burkina Faso that could stand on its own. And that's exactly what he did. In a historic move, Traore launched the country's first ever military school, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. No longer would young African soldiers travel to the West for training designed to reshape their loyalty. Instead, they would be trained at home, in African warfare, African strategy, and African values. Inside these walls, they are taught not just how to fight, but why they fight. They learn discipline, loyalty, patriotism, and above all, sovereignty. Because for Traore, true freedom doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins in the mind. But that was just the beginning. Behind closed doors, a bigger plan was already in motion. Alongside the other nations of the AES alliance, Traore is now spearheading a bold initiative, a continent-first military and defense industry, a powerful homegrown arsenal built by Africans, for Africans. The goal? To end the centuries-old dependency on Western arms dealers. No more begging for bullets, no more waiting for favors. Africa will build its own weapons, secure its own borders, and shape its own destiny. And now, the world is watching. Slowly, the very leaders who once dismissed Traore as inexperienced or reckless are starting to pay attention. They're beginning to see that this young captain is not just full of radical speeches. He's a man with a plan, a man turning vision into results. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso's military has undergone a total transformation. Upgraded, rearmed, and retrained, the security forces are no longer just symbolic. They're delivering real victories on the ground. And that success? It's contagious. Just look at Chad, a country long seen as one of France's most loyal allies in the region. Its president, once handpicked and propped up by Paris after a military takeover, has now turned his back on his old patron. Why? Because the fire lit by Traore didn't stop at Burkina Faso's borders. It spread across the Sahel, across mines, until it reached even the most unlikely places. And in December 2024, the world witnessed the unthinkable. Chad's leadership breaking ranks, publicly rejecting French influence, a shift that no one saw coming, but Traore. In a stunning turn of events, the Chadian authorities made a bold decision to take control of their own destiny. After decades of hosting French troops since the colonial era, Chad finally said enough. They ordered the foreign soldiers out, and like Traore, they're now channeling their energy into building and modernizing their own military forces. But Chad isn't alone. In Senegal, a similar awakening is underway. Leaders not only questioned the continued presence of French troops, they took action. The troops were told to leave. For the first time in decades, African nations are daring to imagine a future where security is not outsourced, but owned. What sparked this wave of defiance? A realization. one that's been building silently across the continent. Relying on the West for security has only deepened Africa's vulnerability. For years, the West positioned itself as Africa's ultimate defense partner. Yet, the violence never stopped. In fact, in countries where Western military forces have been stationed the longest, insecurity hasn't just persisted, it's gotten worse. Terrorism spreads, coups erupt, civilians suffer. The data doesn't lie. The question must be asked, if Western troops were truly the solution, why does the crisis keep growing? Could it be that the presence of the West is not the cure, but part of the disease? As we revealed in a previous episode, the West doesn't just observe Africa's insecurity, it profits from it. That's the harsh truth. The longer the chaos continues, the deeper the profits flow. Because let's be honest, without conflict, who would buy the weapons? Without unrest, how could they justify military bases scattered across the continent? And without fear, what leverage would they have to extend their geopolitical grip on Africa? Insecurity for the West is more than just a problem. It's a business model, a strategic tool for influence masked as help, and it gets darker. Some believe that this goes beyond negligence, that certain Western powers might be secretly funding insurgent groups, fueling the very crises they claim to fight. Is that a conspiracy, or is it just the cold, calculated logic of global politics? Given how much power and profit rides on Africa's instability, it's not a stretch to believe. But perhaps the most painful part of all this isn't what the West has done. It's what African leaders have allowed. For far too long, they've surrendered their sovereignty in exchange for temporary solutions. Dependent, complacent, unwilling to break free from the cycle. And yet, time has proven the obvious. The more Africa relies on the West, the worse things get. This isn't just a political failure, it's a betrayal of the people. Think about that. For decades, African nations have neglected one critical pillar of sovereignty, the ability to build their own weapons. And why? Because they've grown comfortable buying them from the West. But that dependency comes at a steep price. Time and time again, Western powers, especially the United States, have weaponized access to arms as a political tool. Just ask Cuba. The US has blocked it from purchasing vital defense equipment for years. Now, imagine if Cuba had a powerful homegrown military industry. Would US sanctions still hold the same weight? Absolutely not. This is the weakness African leaders have refused to confront. Instead of building, they beg. Instead of producing, they plead. Fear of sanctions has turned proud nations into passive ones, avoiding confrontation, obeying foreign demands, and forfeiting control over their own destiny. But imagine something different. Imagine a self-sufficient Africa, an Africa that produces its own food, builds its own vehicles, manufactures its own electronics, and forges its own weapons. An Africa that no longer answers to the whims of foreign powers. In that world, African leaders would no longer have to bow, they would stand, and so would the continent. But the question remains, how much longer will Africa stay on its knees? How long will it remain dependent, divided, and vulnerable? The good news is, the tide is finally turning. And it's not just the people rising, even African leaders are beginning to wake up. A powerful symbol of this awakening came with the recently concluded International Security Conference on Africa, the first of its kind. For once, African leaders weren't summoned by a Western institution or foreign government. This time, they gathered on their own terms to confront a challenge that has haunted the continent for decades: security. The tone was set from the very beginning. President Paul Kagame took the stage and delivered a message the continent could no longer afford to ignore. He called for African-led solutions to African problems. No more outsourcing the safety of our people. No more waiting for foreign troops to rescue us. Kagame stressed the need to strengthen homegrown institutions, especially the African Union, and urged leaders to finally take ownership of Africa's peace and stability. Because, as he said plainly, relying on external actors has done nothing but delay progress, and now, Africa is done waiting.